Good morning, everybody. Ooh, this is our new. This is it's like sounded like a Trump rally there. The acoustics. Thank you very much for a big welcome to officers and members, obviously, for our planning committee meeting this morning, and thank you for members of the public in the public gallery. You're very welcome. We were going to do item 2, but we've got a speaker that's delayed. Just arrived. So we can do item 2. Yes, we can do item 2. Okay. First of all, can I just point out to members that although we have a new microphone system, and I usually bore them stiff by regaling them with a microphone protocol, I'm not going to do this time. I'm simply going to say, we'll use the new system, obviously it's there, and you can punch the right button when you want to speak. But can you indicate in the normal way by putting your hand up so that we can actually sort of indicate that you want to speak during a debate or ask questions, etc. So we'll keep to that system. So if you just, for this session, just use the button on the right-hand side when you're ready to speak, and then when you're finished, just push it again, and that knocks it off again. So, in that way, I think we'll be fine. I also come now to declarations of interest. Are there any declarations of interest? No. Confirmation of minutes, which were for the meeting on the 9th of October. Can we have a proposer that they're all in order? Councillor Settle and Councillor Pittman. Thank you. Substitute members, please.
Okay, my microphone's not turned on. Councillor Viv Wilder is here for Councillor Chris Dixon, and Councillor Joe Gardner is here on behalf of Councillor Goodman, and I've just been notified that Councillor Jane Nixon is on the way, but currently stuck in traffic.
Okay, thank you for that. We're going to do item 2 first. And item 2, you can find on page 27 of your agenda paper. Item 2. And this takes us to land southwest of Wheaton Road, opposite the Miller's Arms, Singleton. So the protocol is that we do have some speakers this morning on this item, which is why we're holding it first, because if we have speakers, we try to accommodate those to begin with at the front of the meeting. And then there'll be a short presentation by an officer, and then there'll be a break for speakers, and there will be time to obviously respond to anything the speakers say. And then we'll go and complete the presentation. The officer will complete that, and then we'll have questions and debate, etc. Thank you. Hand over to Andrew.
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, good morning, everyone. This application relates to an area of land just on the, well, it's within the settlement of Singleton, but it's on the edge of that settlement, indicated by the circle on your screen. The Miller's Arms pub is here, and then the roads come through up towards the what was Singleton Crossroads, and back down to Fleetwood Road, for those who are familiar with the location. This application is for reserve matters approval relating to 4 dwellings. An outline planning permission was granted for this scheme back in 2021. And that grants the principle of residential development on the site. So what we're looking at now is all the reserve matters. So we're looking at the access, the layout, the scale, the appearance and the landscaping of those 4 dwellings that were approved. The application and your agenda papers is recommended for approval on the basis that there will be a series of planning conditions presented as part of the late observations. Unfortunately, the planning officer handling this application is sick, so he's not been able to draft those conditions. So the late observations proposes that the decision be amended to delegate it to officers so that we can prepare those conditions and then issue a decision should the recommendation be accepted. Just to set the scene a little bit more, this plan shows you the majority of Singleton Village. The application site is the square area or rectangular area in the centre of the screen. That's actually allocated for residential development in the local plan. You can see the other similar shadings are also housing allocations in that plan. The blue area is the village boundary and is also the village conservation area boundary. So that's what you're looking at there. The green areas around it are countryside. As I said, it's for the erection of 4 properties. That's now 2 pairs of semi-detached houses with a single access point from Wheaton Road. They're 2-storey properties and they have quite sort of traditional stylings and arrangements on the site with parking to the front, garages and gardens to the rear and the like. I'll go through those later in detail, but this is to show you the site plan. So that shows the red is the application site. The actual dwellings are within a part of it to reflect the housing allocation. So there's areas around the rear, if you will, from the road and on the approach from the Fleetwood Road side that are part of the application site, but not part of the
Andrew,
dwellings.
do you think you could start again, because we've just had a member who's come
Yeah.
in, and for the sake of a couple
Yeah.
of minutes, I think it's
Sorry.
they can then
Yes.
Happy
take the
to
full part.
happy to
So
do
you've
a
only ju-
if I
you've
do
only
a
just started.
if I do a brief recap of what I've just said for councillor
Sorry,
Nixon.
guys.
It's okay, I hadn't got to my joke, so you can all enjoy that at the same time. So just for recapping that, so the image on the screen here is showing this scheme is for reserve matters relating to the erection of 4 dwellings on a site at Singleton. It's a site opposite the Miller's Arms, which is shown by the application site is the red rectangle that you see in the centre of the screen here. This plan is showing you the village boundary with the blue shading, which is also a conservation area. So the site's within the village settlement boundary, it's within the conservation area. These darker hatchings, I'll not try and guess what colour that is, those darker shadings are housing allocations in the local plan. And this site has planning permission in outline, in a fully outlined planning permission from 2021 relating to the erection of 4 dwellings. So what we're looking at is all the reserve matters relating to that decision. This side explains that the properties are all relatively traditional in their styling, and I will go through those later in the presentation. And I was just on this slide, which indicates the application site boundary with this red rectangle, and then within that there is a smaller parcel where the actual properties are proposed. So you've got a single access point to Wheaton Road, 2 pairs of semis, their gardens, driveways and parking areas, and then an area of landscaping that is located around the rear and on the eastern approach to the site. That's a twisted Google Earth image just to set the scene, and the site is this area here. Obviously you can see the Miller's Arms pub, which I'm now told is called the Greedy Badger.
No, not the Miller Arms.
And there's a reference to them having a set menu. But at that point, I'll leave for the speakers.
I'm going to hand over to the Vice Chair now.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Morning, speakers, members of the public. Excuse me. On this item, I have 3 speakers scheduled, I believe. Councillor Matthew Lee, who I see is here, Councillor Paul Hayhurst, who isn't here yet if he doesn't arrive, and obviously he can't speak. And then we have Mr. Alexis DePaul, who is the agent for the item. Ward councillors Matthew Lee will have theoretically an unlimited amount of time to speak. This is the council's protocol. When we come to Mr de Paul, in line with council protocols, Mr de Paul, you'll have 3 minutes. I do have a stopwatch, so we can time that through. First of all, then, I'd like to call Councillor Matthew Lee. Matthew. Turn that.
Thank you, Chair and Vice Chair. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for your indulgence today. This application is part of a much wider issue. Almost the entirety of the population of Great Singleton are against the building of these houses due to the damage that they will cause to our conservation area. Legal advice has been taken on the matter, and whilst I'm told that existing covenants on the land in question are not material considerations for determining the application today, I do need to tell you that there is a near certainty of legal action against the applicant trust to stop its disposal of the land, which will be in direct contravention of its declaration of trust. Because of this, we need to be extra confident of any decision made today. I should also point out that whilst the application is concerning reserved matters relating to outline planning permission for 4 houses, the same applicant also has a new application in for the same site, but this time with 5 houses. The consultation for this ends on Friday. I don't know how this works. We just keep saying, right, we'll do 4 houses, then we'll try for 5, 6, 7. I don't know how far this goes, but I think it's a waste of our time. I will now give clear reasons why this application has to be refused today. The outline planning for these houses has already been granted. You may think that the application today is only for reserved matters, but that does not mean that we can ignore our own planning policies. We must apply our policies to our applications, whether full, outline or reserved matters. I'm not trying to bore you into submission, but this is imperative that you understand how crucial this is. The advice given by the government in their determining a planning application, when it says how must decisions on applications for planning permission be made, it says to the extent that development plan policies are material to application for planning permission, the decision must be taken into accordance with the development plan unless there are material considerations that indicate otherwise. See section 72 of the Town and Country Planning Act. The Town and Country Planning Act 70.2 is quite simple. In dealing with an application for planning permission or permission in principle, the authority shall have regard to, a few things, the provision of the development plan. Now, in law, there are words we use in everyday life, but they have very specific meanings in law. In this example, the word shall, which we are told, it is in UK law, the word shall is a modal verb. It is used to indicate a mandatory action, requirement, or obligation. I don't think that could be any clearer. I don't know if anyone is in any doubt at the moment whether or not these policies should be applied. Do we all agree our policies should be applied? Okay, let's hope so. In our current plan, Chapter 14 is preserving and enhancing the natural, historic and built environment of the... sorry, excuse me. Apologies for that, Chair. It says... There we go. Yeah, in our current local plan, Chapter 14, preserving and enhancing the natural, historic and built environment. Most relevant today is a policy ENV5, which is the historic environment, and it states, proposals for developments should conserve, protect, and where appropriate, enhance the character, appearance, significance and historic value of the file's designated and undesignated heritage assets. In particular, it lists a few things like Lytham Hall, Ashton Garden, etc. Then it says the 2 planned model rural settlements of Singleton and Thistleton. These villages are specifically outlined in our plan to be preserved. And for those of you not quite sure what a planned rural settlement is, the definition is a planned model village is a mostly self-contained community built from the late 18th century onwards by landowners and business magnates to house their workers. Model implies an ideal to which other developments could aspire. So basically, Singleton and Thistleton were built as examples of perfect planning. At the original application, this was echoed by our own conservation officer, who said, "The buildings planned by the village creator, the Miller family, were positioned along the road in the mid-1800s, and the linear format has created a distinctive village character. Worswick's farm, that lies adjacent to one of the original farms, and has high heritage value in the village. The application site farm field seems to be associated with Worswick's farm, that has been partly developed in the 21st century. Keeping to land behind the roadside, which has achieved the objective of not upsetting the established village format." And please listen carefully now, the last sentence. "To create new dwellings roadside would upset the character of the village to the detriment of the historic environment." That's our own conservation officer. That is quite clear. This is not only not keeping it, it is a clear breach of our own plannings. I repeat, ENV 5 states proposed development should conserve, protect and enhance the character, appearance and significance. This is a high threshold to achieve. Conserve, protect, enhance are all such strong, positive ideals. If any member is thinking that these homes aren't too bad, you're not applying the policy. If any member is thinking that this is just NIMBYism, you are not applying the policy. As I showed earlier, the law is clear. You must apply our planning policies to your decisions. Even though this is an application for reserved matters, you still must apply our planning policies to your decisions. The important issue today, therefore, is the design of these houses. Personally, I'm not a fan of modern architecture. However, I think these designs before us are actually very good and a credit to the architect. However, these designs are totally at odds with protecting our conservation area. They look like new builds and they will stand out like new builds, the opposite of what should be in a conservation area and contrary to our planning policies. From the picture you saw before, these houses, as you drive into Singleton, they are there. They're the first things you will see driving in along the side of the road. What is now fields will be there. Thank you, Andrew. You'll see there. As you drive up on the left-hand side, you'll just see all these new build houses. They're completely at odds with the conservation area and how the rest of the village looks. In relation to the specifics of our policy ENV5, do these designs conserve our model village? No, they change it significantly, so a breach of planning permission. Will this protect our model village? Not in any way. Do these designs enhance the character of our model village? No, quite the opposite. Our conservation officer said this would upset the character of the village, so another clear breach. Do these designs enhance the appearance of our model village? No, they look completely out of place and bear no relation to the existing architecture. Do these designs enhance the significance of our model village? No. Do these designs enhance the historic value of the model village? No, they dilute our historic value. Therefore, the only way you can grant today's application is by refusing to apply our policies. And one last point to show how important this is. The 14th of August 2023, application 230440 was refused. The application was for an existing property directly opposite this site. It's one of the houses you can see there. The application was for formation of a rear dormer and 2 roof lights to the front slope. Singleton Parish Council gave no objection. However, in the refusal, this 10-page report, the reasons, one that's stated here, in this case, the criteria contained in the policy GD7 of the final plan are of the greatest relevance, having particular regard to the development effects of the character and appearance of the area arising from its design, followed by the impact on the amenity of the surrounding occupiers. So, a dormer with 2 roof lights would impact on the amenity and the surrounding occupants. But building 4 houses directly opposite wouldn't? Okay, so I'd love to know why not. These surrounding occupiers currently have open countryside views literally all the way to the coastline. From those houses there, from the Miller Arms, you can see straight across the flat Parkhurst countryside. You can see Blackpool Tower. It's incredible views. Just you only see a small part of it there. The Miller Arms is an asset of community value. It's the only place in there where the villagers meet. So they have a big outdoor area, so people sit there. With these houses opposite, this becomes just another urban pub. So, 2 planning applications, exactly the same place. A dormer window is refused because of existing planning policy, but 4 houses are recommended for approval. I just do not understand that. As members of the council, and members of this committee in particular, we cannot simply choose which of our rules and policies we want to apply and to whom. We absolutely cannot apply our policies to one application, but not to another, especially when they are just a few feet and a few months apart. Now, having just had sight of the late observations, or lack of them, with such important issues at stake, I do not believe that the conditions should be delegated. For example, the recent application had representations from LCC Archaeology, stressing the importance on the site for archaeological discovery. Singleton was mentioned in the Doomsday book. There's an incredible amount of stuff down there. I know stuff's not the quite right word. So, members, please do the right thing. Follow the law as you did in the previous decision and refuse this application. And so those of you still awake, thank you for listening to me. I'm happy to answer any questions members may have, but if you're as sick of my voice as I am, then I understand that maybe not.
Thank you.
No?
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Can we take questions?
I think at this stage, I think we move through and then there are questions later on, Councillor Collins.
Yeah, but, yeah, all right.
Can I take some guidance on that?
Chairman, I would say, sorry. Chairman, I would say we're in the public speaking part of the committee at the moment, so we need to go through the public speaking, and then if there are questions, obviously that's later. Because Councillor Lee is a member of the committee of the council, I think he can, unlike other members of as public speakers, can actually be referred to in the discussion.
In previous applications, I have come back in again and answered things. So I'm fine answering questions later on.
Okay, all right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I'm now going to ask the officers to either respond. Yeah, we've got another speaker. So when we've done that, then we'll continue with the protocol. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Have we got the next speaker? Come on. Vice Chair will sort this one out.
Chairman.
Thank you.
Mr. Alexis DePaul, who Alexis, if you'd like to come forward. And unlike the previous speaker, I'm afraid you are limited on time. 3 minutes. I'll give you a 15-second warning to sort of wrap up, and if you're still speaking, I'll shout you down if necessary.
Okay, thank you for the opportunity to speak. I'm really here not to reiterate what's in the committee report, but just to respond to some of the comments made by Councillor Lee. I would agree with Councillor Lee that applications have to be determined in accordance with the development plan. Where I fundamentally disagree with Councillor Lee is ultimately this application is in full compliance with the development plan. What Councillor Lee has not highlighted here is that this is a site that is allocated for housing in the local plan. It also has outline planning permission for housing in the local plan. So Councillor Lee's entire premise that the development of this site is in some way going to harm the conservation area and is contrary to the plan is manifestly incorrect. This application is a reserve matters application. The principle is already established. This is to establish whether or not the 4 dwellings as designed are appropriate in accordance with the conservation area. Now, our client has worked tirelessly with your officers, and the scheme that's in front of you now is fundamentally different to the scheme that was originally submitted because it has been amended in almost every respect: roof form, elevational treatment, layouts, design, chimney stack forms, boundary treatments, landscaping, to be amended to reflect what your officers felt was necessary to make it in keeping with the character of the conservation area. It's got no objections from Growth Lancashire, who this council consult to establish whether or not there would be harm to the conservation area. It's only got only one member of the public has objected to this application. And ultimately, it is a very well-designed scheme, and I note that even Councillor Lee accepted it was a well-designed scheme. So, ultimately, the basis of Councillor Lee's comments are fundamentally flawed, because as a council you cannot refuse permission on the basis that the development of this site is unacceptable, because it already has permission and it is allocated. With regards, there was a mention with regards to a covenant. I mean, I have asked about this covenant. I'm not aware of any legal action being taken or anything of that nature. However, that is a civil matter. It's nothing to do with the determination of a planning application. And we are aware, and as you are aware,
please.
there is another planning application in, but that relates to a larger site than the one that's in front of you, and it is a separate matter which the committee will have a separate opportunity to comment on when that application is presented to you.
That is your time up. Thank you very much indeed. Chairman.
Thank you, Vice Chair. We'll move back to the officer who will complete his presentation.
Just a point of order. There was some inaccuracies in what was just said then. I was misquoted on a few things that I was apparently said.
Okay.
So could I quickly address those now?
I think I will allow you to do that, yes. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Is that to come up or from here? I don't.
You can do it from there.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Mr. De Paul said that I admitted this was a well-designed scheme. I said nothing of the sort. I said I liked the design of the houses. That is not the same as a well-designed scheme. It bears no relation. It is a serious misrepresentation. The one objection, this is because there have been public meetings, there have been people coming to there. We've literally had members of the public crying in our parish council meetings. It's come through the parish council. That is the way these things should be handled. So whether it's one or not is irrelevant. There are action groups set up. There are numerous meetings have been held and so on. So that one objection is not correct on that. And just because amendments are made to plans along the way, it doesn't mean to say we do not have to follow our policy. We can make 1,000 changes. It's not, it's how many changes need to be made to where we get default granting of an application. So I don't get that. And my point, and the key point here, where it said I was fundamentally flawed, is I'm not saying about the allocation of these houses. That permission's already been given. I'm well aware of that. I'm saying that this design is in contravention of policy ENV5. Not that trying to stop the housing. It's just that what's before us today is not acceptable. Thank you.
Well, thank you for those clarifications. Thank you. I'm going to hand over to Andrew, and in finishing his presentation as well, there'll also be an opportunity for officers to respond to some of the questions and issues and concerns that have been raised by yourself, Councillor Lee, as well. So in that process, that's what we usually do. Okay, thank you. Andrew.
Yeah, perhaps I can start off with a clarification about the publicity point. It is factually correct that we had one representation from members of the public in regards to this application. We undertook the noble publicity, so in this case we wrote to a dozen properties around the site to inform of the application and invite comments. But as a factual point, we received one comment back. We did receive representations from the parish council. Obviously, that's included in full in the papers. We also undertook the statutory publicity with regards to site notices and advertisements in the press as well. So that perhaps covers that point. I don't know whether Mr. Curtis wants to come in and touch on the legal point that's been made whilst that's kind of in the forefront of the comments.
Yes, Chairman, if it helps, just to cover a couple of matters, just to point out to the committee this is a reserved matters application. That means that only the matters covered by the application are before you for decision. Those are access, appearance, landscaping, layout and scale. The principle of the development, whether there should be housing upon this site, is already accepted by the council by virtue of the outline permission, so that's not up for discussion this morning. If there had been significant public opposition, or if there is significant public opposition to the development, that's not a factor in and of itself for you to take into account. The matters, as Councillor Lee has rightly set out in his presentation, that you need to take into account are the development plan and any other material planning considerations. On that point, the breach of trust which is being alleged, and what I think is being alleged about the landowners, is they're a charitable trust, and is that they've acted in contravention of their governing document. Whether or not that is the case, I have no idea, but it is certainly not a material planning consideration which you're entitled to take into account this morning. The point's been made, and made forcefully, that the council has a legal obligation to consider planning applications in line with the Town and Country Planning Act. In other words, in accordance with its local plan and any other material considerations. That is certainly the case, and the officer's report in this instance and in every planning application is the professional advice of the officers on how the planning application in question meets the requirements of the local plan or not, and as to which other material planning considerations are in play and how they could be dealt with by the committee. So that is clearly the case, that the planning application needs to be determined in accordance with that, and the committee report, the officer's report, attempts to guide members as to how they should approach that. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Ian. So, go back to the officer. Thank you.
Thank you. So just a very quick recap. This is the site we're talking about. So 4 dwellings facing onto Eaton Road, opposite the Miller's Arms. These are the street scene images that have been provided of the pair of dwellings that we're now looking at. So as you can see, two-storey properties, traditional in their form, pair of semi-detached houses, got some sort of rural features in terms of their window arrangement, the window styling, the roof pitches, the use of chimneys, the porch details. All those sorts of areas are are typical of features in Singleton and other rural parts of Fylde. In terms of house layout, again, it's very much as you would expect. They are 4-bedroom properties, all the bedrooms on the first floor, accommodation split over 2 floors, so all the bedrooms on the first floor, all the reception, lounge, dining facilities on the ground floor, and an integral garage. One pair of the semis is rendered, one pair of the semis is of a brick construction, and it will be that kind of detail that will be covered by the conditions when they are drafted, should permission be granted. I've put this slide up because this side elevation is, whilst you've got the front of the properties, because of the position of the site, the side elevation will be visible when you're approaching the village coming from Fleetwood Road. So there's been in one of the areas of design changes, and I've got a slide to show the layout later. One of the areas of design changes has been to enhance the side elevations of the properties to make more articulated in planning terms, so you've got features in there rather than just a blank gable wall being the view. You've got some interest added to the side elevation there to assist with softening that approach and into the centre as you come into the village from that direction. Just to recap, perhaps covering the points that Mr Curtis said, that we have had planning permission has been granted in outline back back in 2021. It was actually one of the Zoom committees that we had, I think, that we did the decision at. But that sets out the principle of the development, and we're just looking at the reserve matters. And furthermore, this site is allocated for residential development. So these are some images to show the site. So the site's on the left-hand side of the road here as you're coming in. This is the Miller Arms. What you can see here is you've got properties that do have render. You've got obviously the brick. You've got other rendered properties, other brick buildings. There is a real mix of those materials in the village. Pretty much everything is two-storey. So again, that's why that scale of development is one that's appropriate. In a closer view, again, you can see you've got dwellings that are brick, dwellings that are rendered, all two-storey, slate roof, gable features, traditional window arrangements, very much as you see on the properties that are proposed here. Which, bringing you back, you've got that layout with the materials, with the windows, with the roof details and chimneys and the like. Again, just going through some more. So that's one of the properties. With regards to the site, because you've got this area of landscaping around it, there are elements of railings to provide boundary treatments. There are elements of fencing between to provide privacy. There's a landscaping belt to provide hedges around the sides of the garden areas. Hedges along the front, broken up by the central access point rather than having 4 driveways. You've got a single access point, which allows for hedges along the front, each with a private pedestrian access point. And then there's a hedged bin store facility in the front of each, which was a concern to address a concern raised by the Highway Authority over refuse collection arrangements. So if we look at the 5 reserve matters, means of access, again, single central point of access, parking for each unit, both in an integral garage and then in parking spaces provided to the fronts of each property. The layout reflects the building line approach that's found elsewhere in Singleton. The character of the village is very much of properties fronting onto the main roads that run through the village. It's not an area where you have access roads coming in and cul-de-sacs of development. Very much, it's very much fronted on, and that's the approach here, and that gives you the layout that we've got. Scale, 2-storey properties, so very similar in scale to the properties that you saw on the images I provided of the remainder of the village. And again, touching on the appearance, there have been changes to introduce that articulation. There's been that's a mix of brick and render. You've got those materials, you've got those rustic elements with the timber porches and gables and that like. And then finally the landscaping, touched on the hedges to soften the boundary treatments, given that it is obviously in a relatively sensitive location on that approach from the east. Just to cover on some of those changes, the image on the left is the original scheme that we had presented. So you can see there it was 4 detached properties. They were pushed further back into and out of the site because the housing allocation is this smaller parcel. So they've been pulled together. The detached garages have been made integral to reduce the level of building. We've got more landscaping between the properties to open up views between the properties rather than having hard surfacing and then a double garage filling that space. And obviously we've got the hedging and landscaping that would sit around the outside of the properties to give that sort of bookend, if you will, to the extension of the village boundary. And bringing that all together, this is the last slide I have for you. It's for 4 dwellings. It is a sensitive site. It is in landscape terms. It is sensitive because it's in heritage terms. It's in the conservation area. So we do need to look at preserving and enhancing the character of the village. Having sought guidance from Growth Lancashire, as was mentioned earlier, as our specialist advisors on heritage matters, their comments in the report conclude that it is a discrete addition to the settlement. It's not overly harmful to the conservation area, and with the design changes that we've presented here and are evident from the plans, the impact on the conservation is not going to be one that is harmful from the matters that we're discussing here, bearing in mind that the principle is already established by the outline and by the housing allocation. The access and parking arrangements have been reviewed by the Highway Authority. They're satisfied that they're appropriate given the reference to the refuse collection that I mentioned earlier, and therefore we come to a resolution that recommendation that the application be supported, which is obviously a change from the agenda papers due to my colleague's illness in the last week and the inability to pull the conditions together. Chairman.
Thank you, Andrew. I'm just going to bring in Mark now, and then I'll bring Councillor Collins in for a question.
Thank you, Chairman. Can you just go back to the elevation of the drawings? Just to reiterate, in terms of the drawings that have been shown there, that is 1/2 of a pair of semi-detached houses. You can see there's a break line, or you might not be able to see that there's a break line. There's a dotted line. So those are 1/2 of a pair of semis. So the other side will be obviously handed a mirror image of that to produce that. It's just a zoom in on the detail, just to reiterate that. I think the other thing I just wanted to say is that in terms of some of the comments that have been mentioned so far, some of those comments relate to the original application in 2020, in terms of, for example, the comments made by the Regeneration Urban Design Manager at the time. And as Mr Stell says, the latest comments that we have are those of the of Growth Lancashire, so the former conservation officer for local authority there now works with Growth Lancashire, have provided those comments and concluded that there wouldn't be harm to the conservation area as a result of that development in the form shown. The comments originally were related to an outline scheme which had an illustrative plan, and they were then subject to further changes, etc., and producing a scheme that was approved in outline with an illustration of 2 pairs of semi-detached houses to try and keep that form of the village. So I suppose the issue for the committee today is not necessarily whether the application is in accordance with the policies, because you have one view being presented to you by officers that they are in accordance with the policies, and you have another view being put forward by Councillor Lee that they are not. The issue is how the design, whether the design itself actually achieves what's intended by those policies. So the issue there is that you have the views of your officers and the views of the council's conservation consultant saying that they are appropriate for the conservation location, and my view will be that is a very traditional form of development. It has the traditional materials, traditional features, chimneys, etc. And my question to the committee will be what form of development might be more appropriate to the character of the conservation area than that. Obviously, that's open for the debate for the committee. Thank you, Chairman.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Councillor Collins, you wanted to ask a question earlier on, so I'm bringing you in now. Have you got your microphone on?
Just looking at what's before us on the screen, how does the height of those buildings compare to the heights of other dwellings in Singleton Village? I asked that because, you know, you've got some of the villages in the Fylde that once had small houses, and you drive through now, and they've been sort of like invaded by massive houses because
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the answer...
Do you want to switch your microphone off so that it works?
Actually, 2 microphones do work at once on
Yeah,
this system,
yeah.
I think. But
Or the 3 on there.
yeah, okay. In terms of the actual height, I'm afraid I can't give you a measurement that this is 8 metres and the property opposite is 7 metres. I can't give you that mathematical answer. What I can confirm is that the majority of properties, or almost exclusively properties in the village, are 2-storey dwellings. So this is obviously is an image from the street opposite, just outside where the application site is. So this shows you the context is very much 2-storey. The properties of the model village era development that Councillor Lee referenced are perhaps more of this style, where some of the more recent developments, that I think this is Worswick's Farm, have a perhaps slightly taller height. This property is next door to the application site rather than these properties. So I think that the properties that are shown on the image probably are slightly taller than those that are prevalent around the village. But they remain, I think the key thing for me is that they retain that 2-storey scale. So that whilst I can take the point that there have been developments such as properties in the middle of trails that you'll be familiar with, which are very large properties of that scale. These aren't of that type of scale, albeit they may well be taller than many of the more historic properties in the village at 2-storey, largely as a consequence of changes in construction and insulation and the like that are required in modern properties.
Yes, Councillor
yeah, I'm not really satisfied with that answer.
I might
There's 2-storey and there's 2-storey. I mean, you know, you can have quite a low 2-storey building, you can have a very high 2-storey building. I'm really not happy unless we have sort of like a comparison of the heights of these dwellings with other dwellings in the village. I mean, looking at the plan, they are big houses. And when you look at what's been built elsewhere, you've got big high roofs that simply are not in keeping. So probably slightly taller isn't good enough. I mean, I'd really like to know the detail given the sensitivity of this location.
I think Councillor Lee was trying to assist there, so I'm going to bring him in at that stage.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, it's actually, I take Councillor Collins' his point there. In the presentation that was given today, it said the scale is similar in scale to existing buildings. I absolutely, completely disagree with that. Now, it's now come back that it's been sort of clarified saying, well, existing scale as in they're both 2 stories. Well, that is, I think that makes a scrap of difference. I mentioned before is that Singleton, it was a model village. It was built for the farm workers. So the majority of these buildings are mostly 2-bedroom and some are 3-bedroom. These are small workers' cottages. This is a chocolate box little village. It's our model village. And you've seen pictures there. You can see exactly what these are like. These are strips of small little cottages all joined together and keep that lovely picturesque heritage. Whereas these houses are big 4 bedrooms. So they are double the size of most of the existing applications. Councillor Collins' point there about, you can see there, it looks to me like the roof, the height of the roof there is almost is actually higher than another storey. That's potentially higher than a 3-storey with a less sharp roof. So the scale point, I think, is completely wrong, and these are potentially double existing sites there. So Andrew, would you mind going back to the slide that says enhanced character, please? It's got the picture on there of Worswick's Farm, the photograph. Okay, thank you. Left-hand side there, the white building, that is Worswick's Farm. Worsix Farm goes back to 1800s. However, that building there is one of the newest in Singleton. The building was in such a poor state, it had to be knocked down, but was replaced with an exact replica. No one here thinks that looks out of place. That is preserving the historic environment. That is preserving the conservation area. That is a new build. Nobody realises it was built exactly the same. In fact, a small point here. Above the door, you'll see a little window, and it's off to the side. And at the time when it was being built, people complained saying they can't even get the window in the middle. It's off to the side because the original window was off to the side. It's an exact replica. I was chair of the Village Hall Committee when we received our funding from the Lottery Commission. We knocked that down and we rebuilt an exact replica. It preserves the historic environment. It enhances our conservation area. It made the building better with more modern. So this is not about, I'm not arguing at all with the principle of the houses, I don't want them there, but this is not there. This is about these designs, purely about the designs. If these designs now were sort of for 4 little workers' cottages, the same as the rest of the village, I wouldn't be able to stand here today and make my points. So this is the point. So as Councillor Connor spotted there, is these houses are so much bigger and totally out of keeping with the village. And again, if these were nice, sympathetic, like Worsix Farm there wouldn't be an issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Lee. Councillor Wilder?
Thank you, Chair. I appreciate I've just come into this. So it's a question, actually, about on page 30 of your presentation, about the Charity Commission. You might have already done this before, but looking into this at the sale of the land, has that actually been clarified, or absolutely want to know, because I think it might change everything.
My understanding is that that was the point that Mr Curtis made earlier, where he informed committee that the legal issues relating to, or any legal issues relating to the sale of the land and how that might be prevented by certain legal matters, is entirely separate from any decision that we would make here as a planning committee, or you would make as the planning committee on this planning application.
Yes, Chairman, yes, that was the case. I didn't, because I haven't got eyes in the back of my head, I didn't realise, Councillor Wilder said she'd just come into it. I'm not sure whether she meant she's just arrived during the debate, or, right, no. That's fine then.
No. Thank you. Have you completed your point? Yeah.
If I may, yeah.
I just feel that the actual planning is if they do want to sell the land, depending on the monies and goodness not else, but if they turn around and said no, you can't build on it, what a waste of time we're doing. Sorry.
Is that a planning consideration? I probably think it isn't. But
No. I mean, we determine applications on behalf of applicants who don't own land and do all the time, and it's up to the opportunity to develop land is there through having a planning permission for it and having control of the land and the legal opportunity to implement that control. So we're just one sort of part of that jigsaw, if you will, but we're not prejudiced in making the decision on this planning application by the availability or otherwise of the other pieces.
thank you. Councillor Evans.
Good morning, Chair. Thank you very much indeed. I understand the strength of feeling on this proposal. I did look at the Miller Arms as a potential purchase, so I have actually been inside looking out at the view opposite. I also note that when you drive into the village, the farms to the right of the Miller Arms, it is a very much an industrial farming area. My points are twofold, really. One, I personally prefer to see smaller developments in these little areas of permitted development as opposed to larger builders coming in and building multiple houses. So I think there's some merit on a small developer. My other point is on procedure, really, that it doesn't sit well with me that obviously planning applications by their nature are long and quite often protracted, and there's obviously been quite a lot of discussion between officers and the developer to try and get the best possible result. But I'm quite concerned that we're being asked to basically devolve decisions on the basis of the fact that there are no conditions at all at the moment. And I understand that's due to illness, but we are being asked to pass judgment on something without actually seeing those conditions. And conditions, as we've seen in other applications, are very important because they do allow us on the committee to actually create some kind of ring fence around what's being proposed in front of us, and gives us some confidence as planning councillors that those conditions that we apply give some certainty to the residents in the area already. So I have got concerns that we have no conditions on this, and I would have suggested that actually the application should have been delayed until such time as we could have seen and looked at those observations together, because it is a contentious application. I would feel happier on that basis that, in light of not having conditions, may I suggest one condition, that is that this, if it does get passed into the next stage, that it can only be for 4 houses, and we can't see then a further application down the line to either increase the size, which alludes to Councillor Collins's point, or even an extra house on that site, because we are being asked on faith. And I do have trust in the officers that present in the best case scenario to us. But I do think that we should actually be presented with a full application, and that does also contain conditions. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to bring the officer in who wants to respond to that.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. Obviously, when I put the agenda together just over a week ago, sorry, I was expecting that we would be able to have conditions ready for you. Unfortunately, the officer dealing with it, he's been away this weekend and seems to have contracted COVID. So he's not been in work and been able to provide those conditions. I don't see that the conditions on this particular scheme are likely to be particularly contentious. I can understand members' concerns that they aren't available, but I would expect the conditions to cover matters like ensuring the landscaping is implemented, ensuring the materials reflect the character of the area, removing permitted development rights so that there isn't the opportunity of adding the 3rd floor into the properties, ensuring that the parking is provided and the access is... ensuring that there's an archaeological investigation prior to development taking place, all of which are relatively standard matters that you would expect for a development and that we deal with under delegated powers each week when we're dealing with applications of this scale elsewhere. Just coming back to Councillor Evans's particular point, this application is a reserved matters for 4 dwellings. There is no scope under this scheme. You can see that the 4 dwellings occupy the area of the site. There is no scope for a 5th, 6th or 7th dwelling to be fitted onto this site. There is a separate application which proposes a more intensive form of development, but that application will be considered on its merit relating to how its particular application site, and there wouldn't be any legitimate opportunity or any need to impose a condition about erecting further dwellings to this particular decision, because that would be covered under the assessment of the applications that are alongside it or may follow.
Right, I'm going to bring in Councillor Ledger next, and then Councillor Farrington.
Thank you, Chair. So I wanted to ask, I'm not sure which officer about, so we've established that this is under this is a reserved matters application, so we're not discussing whether housing should or shouldn't go ahead. We're discussing more softer things like aesthetics and appearance. So I wanted to ask if we're giving views that we don't like the design or we do like the design, and we were minded to, say, refuse this application on our opinions of its design, is that something that is legitimate, and is it something that, say, if there was an appeal later, what sort of arguments would there be against our views on that?
I'll take that one, Chairman. Yes, thank you. Yeah, so as I said earlier, the application is reserved matters, so that, and as Mr Curtis said, that the issues are restricted to those particular issues. One of them obviously relates to design and the scale of development. So if the committee are of the opinion that this scale of development is overly large for the site, then that obviously could be a legitimate reason for refusal. Obviously, in regards to that particular matter, the officer report sets out an assessment and comes to a different conclusion to that. And obviously our external consultees looked specifically at the character of the conservation area, has come to a different conclusion to that. So the committee, obviously, that's a recommendation in front of the committee. The committee is quite at will to be able to come to a different conclusion and may weigh the issues differently to those which have been put forward by officers and our advisors. So the thing that the committee would have to be sure about really is, you know, the reasons for going contrary to that recommendation. And as we always do in situations such as that, there would obviously be an opportunity to adjourn the meeting to discuss those issues. Notwithstanding obviously what other people have said about potentially deferring the item, if there's a mover and seconder for deferral, that vote would normally be taken first. Hopefully that answers your question, Councillor.
Thank you. No, that's very helpful. I think, I see in the report and what you say about officers' comments and conservation comments that this is in keeping. I guess for me that's quite subjective. I see what the applicant has done here and the attempt to have this more in keeping, but I don't think it quite meets the level of in keeping with the rest of the village. Whilst I see that the two properties next to it, opposite rather, next to Miller Arms are, I wouldn't say in keeping with the rest of the village. Looking at this application, the style of the properties, I mean, even things like the integrated garage and just the style of them do not, to me, seem in keeping with the rest of the village. And I do take what Councillor Lee said about the farm further up where it was rebuilt in a much more traditional style. That is something more in keeping with the rest of the village. And if we are, I guess it's down to personal preference, but for me this is too modern, not in keeping with the village at all. And I would urge us to try and protect and preserve the style of the village at least, to a much more strict standard than what we're seeing here. Thank you.
Thank you, and I think it sort of raises an interesting part of our scrutiny and our judgment here, that when we look at design and appearance, etc., there inevitably is a level of subjectivity in terms of, how some people might see it differently. Even walking around the village and seeing what exists, some people might make a case that there is a resonance there, and other people might say actually it's not in character, etc. And that I think demonstrates the sort of spectrum of planning judgment as well, that it's not necessarily black or white, but there are sort of shades of different opinion, which all ought to be respected. So thank you for your views there. Councillor Farrington.
Thank you. I've got some comments about the design, but I first want to start with just the protocol of discussing an application in great depth. only to know that there's a follow-up application that will probably, I'm guessing, and maybe you guys can confirm this, whether it's going to go back to taking the full extent of the red boundary there to have a slightly more intensive and money-making format for their next application. What I don't understand, and maybe this can be explained to me before I come back with my other observations, is why do we discuss something in great depth only knowing in advance that the applicant is going to not start building, but they're actually going to then follow up with a completely different application on the same land? And then maybe once that's been answered, I'll go on to my observations.
Mark, please.
Chairman, yes. The council deals with a great number of applications which never see the light of day. The grant of planning permission gives somebody the opportunity to develop, not requires them to carry out that development. And there will often be situations whereby somebody tries their hand at a particular proposal, it gets it gets approved, and then they have different thoughts. Quite often land is passed on to other owners, for example, and they have different thoughts about how to develop the site. So it's not unusual to get more than one application on a site. What the council's charged with doing is determining the application before it. So at this moment in time, we are determining an application for 2-person semi-detached houses. In the future, we may well be in a position where we're considering an application for 5 dwellings. That will be considered on its merits. It may well be that that application is acceptable. It may well be that it's not. We don't know at this time. So what we need to do is to look at this on its merits in terms of its standalone. It's an application for 4. It may be frustrating that the committee spend a lot of time dealing with an application which might never see the light of day, but we don't know. Let's say that second application may be refused, and therefore this is the fallback position.
Thank you, Mark.
Just also bring Ian in, because he might be able to contribute to this as well.
Just to reiterate. To reiterate the point that Mark's made, we do have a legal obligation to determine planning applications, whether or not there's another planning application potentially waiting in the wings. If the council doesn't determine a planning application, then after a certain amount of time, which Mark and Andrew would be able to advise what that is, then the applicant is entitled to appeal against the non-determination of the application, and the council would then have to either reach a view on what position it would have taken, had it taken a position, and or risk being liable for costs in an appeal. So there is an obligation to consider an application regardless of whether or not there may be another application for the same site in the pipeline.
Sorry, I'm trying to... Yeah, that's on. Thank you. That's clear. Okay, I suspected that would be the general answer. So it does come down to just looking at this particular application on its merits. An interesting comment was made earlier about it being subjective and maybe down to personal preference. I'd actually argue against that notion. I think when you listen to some of the points that Councillor Lee made, and you look at the actual aesthetics and design of a village that was constructed around the 18th and early 19th centuries, then if you applied actual scientific measurements and in the construction and proportions of the dwellings, then you would come to the conclusion that these bear no relation. You have to put yourself back into that time frame because you're trying to replicate what went on around that time. And I don't know where the integrated garages come in. I mean, it would be a nice place to park your horse, I suspect, but it's rather odd. So, yeah, and in terms of the pitched elevations, if you look at the other houses that are 2 stories, you pretty much, generally apart from maybe the farmhouse, but the actual slope of that roof is very slight compared to this. That most, you look at the right there, you pretty much building into the roof void, and that's generally the style of the time. So you have to replicate that style to fall within the points that Councillor Lee made in relation to preservation of that sort of chocolate, use the term chocolate box sort of village design. And this clearly, to me, doesn't do it, not just aesthetically and as a personal point of view, but just from a scientific measurement point of view, it bears no relation to the type of dwellings that were built around the time of the construction of the village. And until a plan comes back that actually replicates those types and styles of buildings, then I can't see that I can back this, to be honest. Thank you.
I am just going to comment on something you said there, because I don't think even a scientific approach is completely objective, because you have to have arbitrary boundaries then in terms of, well, scientifically, how different to something else makes it unacceptable. So there's always a level of subjectivity, even in using scientific data, because you have to make a value judgment about how important that is.
Yeah, what
but I take the point.
Yeah, my answer to that would be within the ranges that you talk about. This is so out of the range that I don't think if you did a Venn diagram there'd be much overlap. And you where there's a lot of argument is where there's a huge amount of overlap. There's very little overlap there.
But
I would
that
say.
in itself is a subjective judgment.
Well, no, I think it's
if you
more
say
scientific.
something is way over, how much over?
Well, as we've
That-
not been
that's the
presented
problem.
with actual measurements today due to an illness,
Yeah.
again, I also agree with the comment made that it shouldn't be delegated. I think that Councillor Evans made some really strong and good points in relation to that, and I would echo his views of being uncomfortable to do that, because we're not actually looking at the scientific measurements today, are we? We're looking at pictures,
Yeah.
which backs up your point.
Okay. Councillor Pittman.
Thank you, Chair. I do support the conservation of a village, and I am very hopeful that what appears on this site will be sympathetic to the village, and I am impressed by what the officers have done to produce these two designs. They may well be bigger than the original 19th century, the majority of these dwellings in Singleton. But we're living in the 21st century, and I do feel that we're being rather short-sighted in terms of what is appropriate for, let's face it, 21st century people who expect standards of space, which obviously the original inhabitants of this village did not see. These were probably rented cottages, most of them, apart from obviously this one here, which is obviously a farmer's house. And that's okay. That could be rebuilt looking very similar and have the internal spacings applicable to the 21st century. It looks fine. But you cannot expect that you can replicate what actually is pretty from the outside, but not necessarily useful for people, families in 2024. I am minded to approve this, albeit I wouldn't like to see dormers put in the roof, either front or back, because that's what a lot of people do. But I am happy with what has been put forward, because I do feel that this is the best we can do in 2024 to actually house new people in Singleton. I speak as one who lived and grew up in a very old mid-19th century house. It was a nightmare. They may look lovely from the outside, and they do look, you know, oh, isn't that beautiful? But we've got to accept the fact that houses have to be appropriate for the people and the times that we're living in. And even, I think Singleton has to accept that. Putting small new houses, okay, you know, yeah, you can have a very small family or even only 2 people living there, but you do need to move with the times, and I am minded to approve it, and I would be happy to propose it.
Take note of that, as we usually do on these committee occasions, and we'll move on with further questions and the debate.
Chairman, the next name on the list, Councillor Collins wishes to come back, I believe.
Councillor Collins.
Thank you, Chair. I'm really not happy without seeing how the height of these compares to other dwellings in Singleton. Listening to Councillor Lee and Worswick's farm that's been rebuilt, there's a similar situation in Trails. If you drive through Trails from Kirkham on the right hand side, there's a thatched bungalow, a thatched cottage. That was my granddad's. That was demolished and completely rebuilt further back, and actually won a conservation award, and people wouldn't know that. But you compare that to what's been built on the other side of the road in Trails, it's the monstrosities. They really are not in keeping. A few years ago, I attended a hot air ballooning event in Belgium, and I was invited to the home of one of the organisers, and it was a big old farmhouse. It was lovely. Plenty of grounds. It was a big house, and you know, he showed us round. Then he told me it was 5 years old. I couldn't believe it. It had been built to such a specification, it just, I thought it was 100 years old or more, and it was just 5 years old. I couldn't believe it. So, houses can be built, not that, so that they're just sympathetic to what's already there, but they can be built so they're not discernible from the old houses to the new. Now, can you put up the slide of the 2 semis together? If you think in all the villages in Fylde, historically, houses were built in 1s and 2s. So you might get a single house, you might get 2 semis together of the same design. But you don't get 2 lots of semis together with the same design. One's white, one's brick. That could have been taken out. Those could have been taken out of any estate in the Fylde. They really are not sympathetic. To blend in, they've got to be at the right scale. I'd like to see 2 different designs for the 2 semis. And they've got to be built to a standard which makes them, given we spend years doing the local plan. We've got this EMV5 policy. It's there for a reason. Members spent hours with the local plan. Officers spent hours with the local plan. We've got to heed what's in our local plan in EMV5. And I think what's before us, I really am not happy with. We don't know what conditions are going to be put on. I'm not happy with that design. I cannot accept what Councillor Pittman says. You know, we've got to build bigger houses because it's 21st century. If you want a bigger house, go elsewhere. If you want to live in a picture box village, then don't expect a massive house. You know, there is another scheme for 5 houses. I mean, I wouldn't like to see five houses of similar scale of that. They probably won't fit on, but there would be 5 smaller houses, and they probably might be more in keeping. But until we see them, we don't know. But that scheme, I really am not happy with. We don't have the detail of the height, so I'd like to move deferral till we have more detail, and perhaps give the applicants opportunity to go away and take on board some of the things that have been said here today. So I move deferral.
Yeah, so we have the deferral. We already have some of these proposed approved.
That hasn't been seconded though, so this goes first. Yeah.
Councillor Nixon.
Thank you, Chair. Could we go back to the drawing where it shows the land around the actual properties? That's fine, yeah. We can see the red outline. On the actual sort of model, why is there a gap in the hedge on the, looking at it on the right hand side?
I believe that's an existing field gate that you can see in this location here.
Okay.
So I think that's the existing, that hedge there is the existing hedge that wraps around the south and west of the site. The proposal is to enhance that by an inner hedge around the curtilage of the properties.
So who would be looking after the land around the outer hedge? The space between the inner hedge and the outer hedge.
Yeah, that would be that would be the subject of a planning condition that the developer would be required to make arrangements for the maintenance of.
That'd be in the conditions. Right. Okay.
Yeah, 'cause it's within the application site, so it's part of the. That's where we come back. Sorry, through you, Chairman.
So again, it's
we came back to the original scheme on the left. Sorry to cut across you there, Councillor Nixon. The original scheme on the left proposed that the properties go back to the back end of the site, but in order to reflect the allocation, that's why the scheme now in front of committee is pulls them forward quite a way. So that land is within the is within the applicant's control. So it will be their obligation to retain it as landscaped area.
Yeah.
As part of the sort of trade-off in terms of the settlement of the setting of the village and conservation area.
Which that's fine, but until we see all these actual written conditions, I've got doubts that people being people, humans. Oh, I'll just make a little gate into that next bit of land. I'll just move my garden that little bit. Keep on moving it back and back away, and then eventually put an adverse possession order in because they've maintained it for the next 10 years, etc., etc. And without those conditions that are written down, how do we know that that wouldn't happen? Because to me, that's I'd do that.
I think there's 2 different points there, though, isn't there, Councillor? One is that we haven't drafted the condition that says that area shall be landscaped. I think the concern you're raising is more of what happens if that condition's in place and there's a potential breach of it, which is a matter that we would only know further down the line and would be dealt with by the planning enforcement arrangements
as it would, very beginning,
as it would anyway.
And
it's no different. Sorry to keep. It's no different to one of the other properties in the village doing the same into the field behind their property.
And then the other is an issue with the height of those. They lend themselves to dormers at the back. They absolutely the prime dormer. And again, without conditions being written, that if it was a condition to say at no point is a dormer allowed to be looking out over the back of the, because I think in planning terms, if it was within the permitted development of that property,
a dormer could just go up at any point without a condition being made to stop it, which then would change the aesthetic again of the of the property, because coming into the village you'd see the back of that, you'd see what would be built onto the back of that. And the only other point I've got, which it's right directly across the road, you've got two houses that have been modified, that perhaps once over were small semi-detached. The garages have been, one's got a big extension on the side. There's no integral garage. It may have been at one point, but there's extensions, there's porches, there's driveways. Just where the Miller's Arms right, just bang smack opposite. And unfortunately, they don't fit in with the village. They look horrible. No disrespect to whoever owns them. I hope you don't live in one, Matthew, but they don't fit in with the village at all.
I'm sure no disrespect was...
No, but in respect of, the whole conversation is the conservation of the village, and it just chucks it off a little bit when you've got something across the road like that, and it lessens your argument by saying, well, these don't, because they pretty much, the new, these, other than the height of the roof, they do fit in a lot more with the village than what's directly across the road. My own view on it is, if the height of the roof could be lessened, I think they would look an awful lot better. But again, is that something that could be used as a deferment for?
Yeah, I'm just going to come in here because I'm picking up a sense from the committee that, and Councillor Collins has already moved this, I think. But you didn't have a seconder, did you? Oh, yeah, okay. I'm picking up a sense from the committee here with the questions and the concerns, etc. That and you're quite in order to correct me if I've got this wrong. But I've got a number of other speakers, and I'm just sort of going to put something forward that if you're proposing a deferral and you've got a seconder, would the committee be happy to sort of vote on that in terms of looking at conditions and also perhaps giving the developer a view about design, etc., and giving them an opportunity to maybe revise those plans? Is that? I'm going to let Mark say something here as well, because okay.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. Obviously, yeah, the number of speakers have referred to the lack of a list of conditions. Obviously, that's been explained that the unfortunate circumstances led to that. It is, as Mr. Sell says, an issue that we know quite often deal with, those types of conditions, but it's an issue that clearly is troubling the committee. So if the application is deferred, we could do two things. One is to obviously compile that list of draft conditions, and the second thing is obviously the applicants and their agents are here, so they've heard the nature of the debate as to whether they would want to change the scheme at all. At the end of the day, that would be the decision, and we would consider whatever it is that is put before this committee. I think the other thing is that there's been a lot of discussion about the character of the conservation area, and one of the things about character of areas is very much about experiencing that character in person rather than from photographs, etc. So I think if it is deferred, I wonder whether it would also benefit the committee for a site visit to take place to actually have a look and to have a wander through the village and to look at the various styles of properties and come to a conclusion about whether this is in keeping with the character or not, in their opinion. And obviously we can, unfortunately due to the technology, we've not been able to measure the heights, but even if I can't measure the height of a neighbouring property, so we can also get that information for reconsideration by the committee as well. Thank you, Chairman.
I've got to bring the Vice Chair in once.
Thank you, Chairman. I think this is a very good suggestion from Mark Evans. I think it generally does reflect the committee's views. I think it also reflects what Mr. Curtis said earlier, that we know the principle of development's been accepted, and this is looking at the detail of this application. I'm just looking down the list of speakers we still have, and I think two of the speakers who've not spoken before, Councillor Griffiths and Councillor Settle, had both also indicated when your previous suggestion, but maybe for completeness, if they have anything to add before we put it to a vote, to be sensible.
Opportunity there for those two particular people, Councillor Griffiths and Councillor Settle, very briefly to add to the debate.
Thank you, Chair. I was going to propose the deferral, but Councillor Collins beat me to it, so I'll second it. Thank you.
I think he's got a second, hasn't he, with Councillor Farrington. I think we've already got that one.
Councillor Settle.
Councillor Settle, do you want to add anything, or are you happy with that?
Thank you, Chairman. I want to support Councillor Collins' deferment. That's it.
Okay, so Councillor Evans.
Thank you, Chair, for allowing me to come back in. It's just a brief point, but I think in the interest of balance, I think it's the right decision that we're about to make. But I do note that we are also charged with not allowing pastiche properties to be built in areas. So there is a balancing act there. And I note on page 31 that there are some modern dwellings within the Singleton village, Singleton House and the White Villa is noted here. So presumably there are examples of modern properties, and if they're done right, they can sit alongside traditional 100, 200 year plus properties. So I think we also need to bear that in mind as well. It's obviously a difficult application to look at, and the officers have to put forward the recommendations that they had. So I don't think anybody here is detracting from those recommendations, but it's been a good debate and a good discussion.
So let's be aware that we're voting on a deferral here, and we'll move to that in a moment, and that's to do with the conditions, and also obviously there's an opportunity there to have another conversation with the developer in terms of some of the concerns that we have. What then comes forward, we can't dictate that, but it's an opportunity as a committee that a number of you expressed these concerns, so I think it's the right thing to do. So we'll move to the vote. All those in favour of deferral, please indicate. I think that is unanimous. Thank you for that. So we defer that particular item, and we'll return to it at a later date. Thank you.
May I suggest a short
yes, you can have a comfort break. Yes,
Collins.
okay. We have had a long session.
Chair, can I say thank you very much, and I'll see you all at the Miller Arms.
Right, well, thank you, members, for your time on the previous item. And we now move to item 1. And we thank members of the public for being very patient, sat in the public gallery there. I appreciate that some of these are quite protracted discussions, but that's what we have in terms of the committee. We have in-depth questions, concerns expressed, views expressed, and that's healthy, but it can be time-consuming. Item 1 you can find on page 5 of your papers, and this is Beechwood 2B Clifton Drive. I know you said something about Shakespeare there, to be or not to be, but no, I won't do that. Lytham St Anne's, and we don't have any speakers, and so therefore we're just going to go to Andrew, Mr. Stell, for his full presentation, and then we'll go straight to questions and the debate. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Chairman. This application relates to property or an area of land called Beechwood, or known as Beechwood. Where we're looking at here is just down the coast. This is Church Scar, so Fairhaven Lakes over here, Church Scar, and then this is the start of Lytham Green. Clifton Drive comes through here and wiggles along to the front. And this is an area of land that's between a property that fronts onto Clifton Drive and then the dunes that separate you from the sea defences that have recently been constructed at Church Scar. So the property itself forms part of the site. The application site forms part of the garden to the property at 2B Clifton Drive. This is also within the conservation area, this time the Lytham Avenues conservation area. There is an extant planning permission on this site, which was originally granted on a planning permission for a dwelling was granted on appeal about 10 years ago, and then there was a planning permission granted by this council for a dwelling, and then that is extant. Work has started on that, but not particularly progressed. But that keeps the permission alive, so that's there in the background. And this application is for the erection of a 4-storey building which provides 3 townhouse properties. Now, it's at committee today. Obviously, there's no parish council in that area at the moment, but it's at committee today due to the scale of the development and the public interest that it has gathered. And like the previous one, it's the same case officer, so his same illness has prevented him from doing any work drafting the conditions as I would have hoped before today. So, as I said, it's a erection of 3 townhouses. It's a 4-storey building. There is some basement accommodation and some roof accommodation as well. So it is quite a sizable building. There's a mixture of bricks. There's a real mixture of materials in the property. There's also some works to a boundary wall to be repaired, and then the access is going to be from Clifton Drive using the existing access point, which all will become clear in my later slides. So this is an aerial image of the site, and then the application plan. So again, this is Clifton Drive. So you've got the access point is actually here. I couldn't do the red line to make it do that, but the application site comes in. The application access point comes in here, serves this existing dwelling, and then leads into this area of land that runs between that dwelling and the dunes, Churchgar. You can see there are a series of trees here, and then this property is known as Edenfield. So that's one of the perhaps the largest building on that particular run, which is now converted into a series of residential apartments. No speakers. So this is the building that we're considering today. So as you can see, it's a sizable building. It contains 3 townhouses which run, so it's effectively a terrace, albeit the architect will probably not be happy with me describing it as such, but it is 3 properties that run in a line. So in terms of the floor plans, this plan's actually the other way up, so Clifton Drive's at the bottom of this plan. So you come through the access into a parking area, and then you've got 3 properties, one that's pushed forward, so it's towards the estuary side, and 2 that are more recessed either side of it, that's more towards the land side. But if you go back to the elevations, they each have large glazed features on that estuary facing elevation to take advantage of the views that obviously offers over the estuary and over towards Southport and the wind farm, the existing wind farm obviously. On the landward side, there is also accommodation. That's perhaps more secondary accommodation, and there are some bedroom elements where you see this bottom image here, you've got slanted windows which direct views more in that direction than in that direction where there is a neighbouring property, which I've got some images of to show you later. Again, on this plan, you've got Edenfield here, which is, I think it's three stories building, and then there's a single story element. It's at a slightly elevated site, floor level over this site as well. So whilst we're talking about a building that's got effectively 4 main stories and some roof accommodation, it is on a lower ground level than the neighbouring properties. Slightly complex planning history, which I've effectively run through there. Got the single dwelling, which was approved by the council 2012, allowed on appeal 2014. New dwelling, which was implemented, and a certificate of lawful use confirms that. It was issued in 2021. A bit like the previous application, we have a second application on this site, which is for a building containing 5 flats. Albeit that's not been actively, it's still on the books, but it's not been actively promoted in in perhaps the last 12 months. But the key point from this slide is that there is an extant planning permission for the erection of a dwelling on that site. What was this slide show? This slide shows the site layout of the approved dwelling. So when we talk about the extant planning permission, this is what it is. So again, it's got the same access point from Clifton Drive, which snakes around the existing dwelling. That tree is no longer there, so that's been removed with consent due to health issues. But then there's this rectangular or offset rectangular dwelling which had 1, 2 roof space accommodation and basement accommodation into that location. So those are the things I'm going to talk about in the main part of the presentation. I've covered the planning history. Dealing with the principle, starting point, local plan. It's in the settlement area. Policy GD1 promotes effective use and efficient use of land within settlement areas. Obviously, Lytham St Anne's is the largest settlement in the borough, so it's the area where you would expect most development to be located. This site is in a conservation area, so that requires us to look at the preserving the special character of it. Councillor Lee explained that to us earlier this morning. There are also some listed buildings in the area. The wall between the site and the estuary is listed, and there is also a feature in the Edenfield Garden that's listed, albeit from the impacts of this development has a very negligible impact on those elements of heritage assets, but it is in the conservation area. It has a more wider impact on that conservation area. So this is my slide. So it's in the conservation area, it's in relation to those listed structures. So the first thing that we need to look at when we're looking at the heritage aspect of the development is whether any harm is caused. So what we're faced with is an area of open land that sits between the Edenfield property and the property next door to it, which is called Horizon, and that is a quality in the conservation area. So by building a dwelling in this site, we are losing openness, and we are involving, and that's leading to harm to the conservation area. The next thing that we need to look at is what's the level of that harm. So is it a substantial harm, which is one of the tests? No, it's not. That would relate to where you are knocking down buildings or you are damaging listed buildings in particular. So that leads us to being it is less than substantial harm. So the guidance in the local plan policy MV5 we heard earlier, and in the MPPF says that if you are to support less than substantial harm to a heritage asset, then you need to consider whether the public benefits that come from that harm outweigh the harm that is caused. So this scheme is considered by officers to do that for two reasons. Consider that the harm caused by filling in the open space or occupying some of the open space is relatively limited. There has been excuse me, I've got an aerial image in a second which will show you that the pattern of development may well have historically had a series of open spaces in this location, but that has largely been replaced by development in those open spaces. So the filling of this area of site, this area of the conservation area, is in itself leading to a very limited level of harm to the conservation area. Alongside that, we also look at the public benefits, and the public benefit is obviously of bringing forward a residential development scheme on a site that has planning permission for housing or a house. So you're bringing forward a more efficient form of development to the site, and obviously any housing in sustainable areas brings forward a public benefit. So the officer assessment to you is that dealing with the issue of the impact on the conservation area, the scheme is acceptable because the public benefits outweigh the harm, and therefore that satisfies the requirements of paragraph 208 and policy ENV5. Just to show you what I'm talking about there, the development goes into this area here. So previously, there will have been open space. There's been a series of large properties in that run, and those have been infilled over time. So, particularly around Edenfield, Edenfield's this property here, that had a boundary that did that. And this council sought to resist development at either side of Edenfield to respect its openness, its setting as a building. That was the case we presented to the inspector at the appeal back in 2012, and that was not found to be a valid reason for resisting the development. So the inspector granted planning permission for a dwelling here, granted planning permission for a dwelling there, and that dwelling's obviously now being constructed, and you can see there is a property in there. The inspector took that view based on, I think, the pattern that obviously we've got these dwellings that were built, I think, 20 years ago. There are other instances along that run where you have a largely built up extent of development, with this site perhaps being the one that's at odds with the rest of them. And that's why we're coming to the position that the harm to the conservation area from development within that area is relatively modest. These are just some aerial images to help you appreciate that. The top one's a slanted image from over the estuary, so you can see how the Edenfield property is a traditional grand manor house. You've had this property infilled, one of the ones that was on appeal. This is the appeal site, the application site that we're looking at here. This is an infill property that's been built alongside this more historic villa property. These are obviously recent. These are recent, presumably as a replacement for something that was there. So you've got that pattern of development. And looking the other way, you can see the same thing. This is Edenfield. This is the site. This is and that reveals the same sort of concept where you've got that level of built development in particularly in that midpoint of the depth between Clifton Drive and the Church Scar Dunes. Looking at the scheme, these are some 3D images that have been provided by the applicant's agent. So these are views. This is what we're looking at from Clifton Drive. So this is the access point, the existing access point, the existing dwelling, and then this is where the proposed dwellings would sit into in that street. See, again, once you've come into the site through those gates, this is the Edenfield building. So you can see how Edenfield is a taller building. It's on an elevated platform compared to this application site. And you can see that relationship that's being created. Looking the other way, this is looking from the sort of the back garden, the estuary side of the scheme. So you can see you've got this, of the three properties you see in the one of the recessed ones, the projecting one, and then the other recessed one is around the other side. You can see it in this second image. And this is how they relate to the property next door called Horizon, which has an entirely blank elevation on that side. So that allows this development to sit alongside it without any neighbour amenity type impacts being created to that property. Again, without wanting to overly labour this sort of street scene point, but I think it is an important one here. This top image, these are street scene drawings to show the comparative heights. So you've got the Horizon property next door to it, which is the modern infill. Then you've got this property which reflects the height of Horizon, albeit it's taller itself, but you wouldn't see that height from off-site because of the position of it. And it's lower than Edenfield, which is obviously a much wider and more substantial property anyway. But that you've got a greater separation to Edenfield because that has side-facing windows, and just because of the logistics of the site. So that's how that fits into that street scene when viewed from that aspect. When viewed from the other aspect, again viewed from Clifton Drive, and you do get these views from, I think it's Elms Avenue, you can approach the site from. You've got the Horizon property that it's equivalent in size to, and then you're lower than the Edenfield property. And you've got one of the elements you've got here, again, going back to the previous presentation, you've got a design that, whilst this is clearly more strikingly modern than the previous example was in Singleton, you still have elements of the gabled roofs that you find everywhere along that frontage. You've got brick materials, you've got some more modern materials, but you've got that form of development that, you know, these gables are found on Edenfield, they're found on Horizon, they're found on the Elms, very prominently, particularly on the seaside. So you're keeping those characteristics. So pulling that element together, I feel that the design of the property is appropriate. It's a modern interpretation, but that's the same with many of the infill plots in the Lytham Avenues. It's not like Singleton again, where the properties are. We heard about Worswick's Farm being an identical replica of the previous building. The infills in the Lytham Avenues area have been very much contemporary of the time that they've been built, and that is followed through in the design here, albeit it has those cues back to the gables and the spacing of vertical emphasis to the design and the like that you find on as sort of the main thrust of the conservation area. Penultimate bullet point, so from the aerial images, there's a sort of a copse of trees on the estuary side. Whilst one of those comes out, there are some replacements to give succession planting into that area, so that area will be retained, and obviously the condition will require that to be those trees to be protected during construction, replacements planted, and then they will be managed as a landscape feature that assist with the setting of the properties, particularly when you view back from the estuary side, and obviously it's a well-used pedestrian cycle routes along there. One of the main concerns we've had with this scheme is the relationship to neighbours. You've got the larger properties along that sort of central band of the area, and then you've got some coach house type properties on the Clifton Drive side. That brings you some very close relationships, or relatively close relationships given the scale of the properties. Those have resulted in evolution of the design. Windows have moved. The design of some of the properties has changed. The position of and scale of the building on the site has changed to provide greater offset, particularly to the Edenfield flats, which have habitable windows in them. And we're now satisfied that those relationships are acceptable. So that slide, the Edenfield relationships are now fine. I've got some images to show you these. The New Longy, which is a property to the side of the site. In fact, I can show you that. These images are from New Longy, so this perhaps gives you that context. The application site is in this area here. So this lawned area is the development platform that they're looking to build off. This is a retaining wall that comes up to Edenfield. So you can see Edenfield's got this single storey projection to the side. It's got residential flats primarily over 3 floors. There is a basement element and roof element there that you can see. Sorry, 2 floors with the basement and the roof. The development that we're proposing is smaller, lower than that building, but is taller than the 2-storey dwelling that these pictures are taken from. These are taken from the 1st floor bedroom of this property. What you're looking at here is the dining room to it, and this image is taken from the dining room. So that's horizon in the background, if you will, there, and those are the trees I've been mentioning. So you can see that there will be a close relationship to that property. But if I come back to this slide, talking about that property, that point there where the laser is, that's where that image is taken from. You've got a 19-metre separation to the nearest part of that building. That part of the building is designed with the slanted windows that I mentioned. So whilst from that window there, you will see the building, from that building you will not see into this property because its windows, its outlook only look that way over the parking area and access point to the property. Certainly that's at 1st and 2nd floor. The ground floor windows are more typical, but they are screened by the boundary wall between the properties. So obviously I've been in that bedroom to take those pictures. That was there to help the assessment and this presentation. And having done that, I'm satisfied that that relationship is an acceptable one. We've got a 20-metre separation back to the application property, which has some habitable rooms in this location facing onto this garden area. But again, the design is intended to offset that relationship. And then the Edenfield distance is as you see there, 15.6. Habitable windows face this way. There are no habitable windows facing that way. So again, you've got that, you've got entrances and bathrooms and the like, but you don't have habitable windows. So that prevents overlooking of this garden area here, and obviously into the windows of the property itself. Albeit this garden area, all the gardens, because it's flats, are communal. The final point I wanted to discuss on this slide is this image on the right. So the blue is the position of the approved dwelling. So in footprint terms, obviously what is now proposed is significantly larger, but it is also pulled away from the nearest neighbour at New Longy, so it sits exactly alongside the dwelling at Horizon. It's wider, so that brings it closer to the Edenfield development, but we're satisfied that that separation distance deals with any massing arrangements, and the absence of windows deals with the potential for privacy loss, as I've just described. Those are the images I've shown you. These are further images that have been provided. So this is showing you, that's one that I had before. I'm not sure I've put that in twice. This is showing you from Edenfield. So that's the communal garden area. This is indicating that you've got that blank, or largely blank, other than a couple of secondary windows, elevation, so that there isn't that privacy loss between the flats here and and that townhouse there. The access arrangements, utilising the existing access point, which I meant to put a picture in, but I haven't. There's it's a 2-metre high brick wall onto Clifton Drive, so there's a well-established access point there. The Highway Authority is satisfied that is sufficient in terms of visibility. It's on a straight run of Clifton Drive. The access point is well set back from the road. The parking so that the parking arrangements are acceptable, the numbers of spaces and the reversing arrangements for them and the like, and the additional trip movements are not going to impact on highway capacity. And as I said, the Highway Authority are not objecting to it. So, pulling all that together, the application is one that officers have obviously looked at carefully, been into various properties and looked at it from all sorts of angles, of sorts of design changes, but we are now satisfied that the scheme is an acceptable one. And so the agenda papers recommend approval, but in the absence of the conditions, the late observations recommend that be delegated to the head of planning.
Thank you, Andrew. Move straight to speakers. Councillor Ledger and then Councillor Evans.
Thank you, Chair. I appreciate this is different to the previous application we looked at, but in terms of some conservation type and heritage questions, I noticed from looking on Google Maps and the presentation that some of the houses just on Clifton Drive are much older and traditional, and there's the Grade 2 listed building there and some of the other old manor houses, and then the properties behind that, closer to the estuary, seem much more modern. Look like they've been, I'm guessing, built in the last 10, 20, 30 years. And I also note that you said previously that applications by this council were rejected but lost at appeal. And I think you said that because the design elements were in keeping with perhaps the more modern properties there. But I still note that I think it's on page 17. Someone's referenced the MPPF paragraph 195 about preserving heritage areas. That heritage assets are an irreplaceable resource and they should be preserved in a manner proportionate to their significance. And then there's further comments referencing Historic England's advice that once things have been built on this heritage is basically lost. So I'm torn because I can understand why, if we were to refuse or put too many conditions on this application, which I should say, from the design, I think it looks a bit ugly and not in keeping with the rest, but I do appreciate, I feel that given all the other more modern properties there, that we would be being inconsistent with perhaps and the other properties there. So forgive me, I don't know if I'm really asking a question or just making a comment to the committee or the council that perhaps this is an example where if we are not very strict and very with the designs of historic buildings or buildings in conservation and historic areas, then we basically tie our hands for all future developments along that area, because if this was the first application, say 20, 30 years ago, I would be totally against it because it's totally not in keeping with the historic buildings nearby. But I feel that has lost weight now because of all the other modern properties around it. So yeah, and I think the only other point I would make is I know we were talking about the need for housing, which I totally get and totally support. Given that this is going to be a sea-facing property with those huge windows staring out to the estuary, I don't know, but I'm going to take a guess that they will be very expensive properties that the average citizen probably can't afford. So I wouldn't say that's a need for housing. I don't know if we need more very expensive properties for the average resident and filed. So that point for me is not relevant. I don't know. I feel like I'm just making a comment or a warning to the rest of the council that I feel like my hands are tied to basically support it when we shouldn't.
Just what it can. Go on.
Yeah, just perhaps I think you're right. I don't think there was a question. But in terms of touching on a couple of points that you made, yeah, clearly, it would be a big dwelling, and I'm sure it would be an expensive property. But the council's measured on delivering housing in sustainable areas, so it still is going from the existing 1 property to 3. So I think that's the point in terms of the uplift in residential numbers that this scheme would bring forward if it was to be developed. My point in terms of the planning history is perhaps better illustrated on this bottom slide, bottom image, sorry. So this is Edenfield, and officers and presumably the council, it was just at the time when I joined, filed, there was a concern that Edenfield was the biggest building. Whilst it's not listed, it has that presence due to its scale. So whilst other places in the avenues, in this part of the avenues, have been infilled, Edenfield was more special. So we sought to resist development within its grounds to protect that specialness, and that's why we sought to resist development in this area here, as well as resisting the development in this area here. And those were the schemes that were both lost on appeal, because at the time the inspector felt that the significance of retaining that open space around a non-listed building wasn't sufficient to outweigh the benefits of presumably delivering housing or would be for delivering housing. So that's why we've seen development come forward on this plot, and that's why planning permission was granted for a later scheme on that plot, and that sets the context, I suppose, for how we look at this this development on this site now, albeit for 3 rather than 1.
Thank you. Councillor Evans.
Thank you, Chairman. Well, you've actually answered one of my questions, because I was concerned about obscure glazing down the side of the proposed property that's adjacent to Edenfield, but there aren't any windows on that side, and obviously that was presumably something that was a condition that was laid out when the application was first put in. I take your point, Andrew, and I agree 100% that Edenfield is a special case on that area. If you have lived in the area and you know it of any over the years, it's probably one of the few remaining properties on that stretch from Whitechurch down to the start of Clifton Drive proper that is the original property. So it, dare I say, fashions within planning change, and so over the period of time we may well look at that building in 50 years' time and say thank goodness that it was saved. Number 6 further up was a single house. They were all single villas with sizable plots of land around them, maybe some smaller properties on the roadside that were there to supply the upkeep of those original houses. But it is fair to say that the whole stretch has been massively developed over the years. The line of the trees there, we're not proposing a new line beyond that's been created by the newer properties that have already been built. So the trees to the bottom end of that strip of land are being maintained. So that's not necessarily going to affect the view of the people who live in the apartments at Edenfield, although I don't think that their entitlement to a view is a planning consideration. But it would be good that those new properties are kept to a new front line, if you can call it that. My only concern is that, the developer is definitely sweating the asset on this one, and that, as much as some of the new houses are of substantial size, and I do note that the design is in keeping with a lot of the newer properties that have already been built on there. So if you stand on the seawall and look back, you'll see an awful lot of almost like Porritt style multiple apexes along that one, right the way down to Fairlawn at the far end. So the development is absolutely in keeping with the modern design of what's already gone before. My only concern is that I think squeezing 3 properties into that space is possibly a property too far, but I appreciate that we can only adjudicate on what's in front of us. But if you take number 6, that was 20 years ago, the house was knocked down and 3 properties were built, 3 substantial houses were built in its place. We're now squeezing 3 fairly substantial properties in what is a narrow strip of land as the garden, and I'm not sure whether or not there should have been a bit more pushback as to a possible design for 2 properties, which would have sat a little bit better, but that's my only observation. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Councillor Evans. And people will be grateful when I say that you've made many of the comments that I was going to make, but I'm going to make 1 or 2 additional ones anyway, as you'd expect me to, and emphasise a few points. Obviously, this particular property is in my ward, so I'm very, very familiar with this particular part of Amstel. And I think the real key characteristic here with this area is that you do have some substantial sort of historic buildings, like Edenfield, etc. May not be listed, but it's a grand building, etc. But actually, the character of this particular strip, all the way down there, is very much one of Victorian, Edwardian villas, etc., in its own grounds, and perhaps coach houses and supplementary ancillary buildings that have been built in time, converted into residential accommodation, and also a plethora, actually, of modern development within those gaps. And I'm also mindful here when I'm making some comments of the experience with the planning inspectorate that sort of, you know, we refused certain applications there and it went to appeal and they were given. But that sort of fairly narrow rectangular plot is fairly, some are wider, but it's fairly characteristic of this particular patch. And I suppose we've had a lot of discussions with the earlier application about design and appearance, etc. And, you know, also you can look at this and sort of have some concerns about intensification, development, overdevelopment, etc. But when you actually look at the building in terms of how it's orientated and its footprint, it actually fits in very well with the line of buildings there, and also with the fact that you don't have any sort of windows on either side that directly overlook. You know, 1 or 2 obscure glass windows. The design is clearly modern, and we accept that. But if you were to, and I've been probably in a lot of the properties in and out there, you know, when we're doing our councillor duties, etc., it's a labyrinth. If you don't know this area, it's very difficult to describe that every time you go up a side alley, you discover another building that was there that you didn't know. And there's a combination of, by the way, buildings that have been converted, coach houses, etc., but also substantial modern buildings that have been built in space that has been left. And, you know, we go back to this sort of judgment really about, okay, the public benefits, you get 3 families or, you know, that could be moving into these flats. They will be expensive flats. But you have to look at the setting in which, you know, they're a pretty spectacular setting with all 3 looking out to the estuary, particularly one in the middle, which has had probably better views. But in a sort of way, it sort of works in terms of, because there is that mix of traditional historic villas and more modern building, sitting side by side, it sort of works in terms of, you know, the use of space, and the large back gardens, etc., in those areas there are largely retained and preserved. And in fact, something else that is preserved, which I'm not sure came out so much in the report, but it is a listed wall, I believe, at the bottom, isn't it? And that listed wall is fully retained because that's right at the bottom, goes along the bottom of the garden. So in some ways, it's sort of, it's a big building, and you know, it is going to have some impact on Horizon, which is the house next door, and then you've got Edenfield as well. But also the lower setting of the building helps my view of it, in that, you know, when you look at, we were looking at roof lines earlier on, and you look at the roof lines and they're consistent with the buildings either side because they're set down further. So I think all in all, it's an imaginative, innovative design in my view, and it fits nicely into that space and probably doesn't cause substantial harm to any sort of buildings either side of it. But obviously we have to be honest, it does have a slightly detrimental impact because where there's space and you fill it, you have an impact on neighbouring buildings. But I think it's an imaginative scheme, and I think it's in an attractive setting, and it's very much part of the palette pattern of development in that area. Councillor Farrington.
Thank you, Chair. Actually, you've articulated very well the majority of the points I was going to make, so I'll keep it very short. Is the building incongruous? No, it isn't, because of the eclectic mix of dwellings that continue all the way up the coastline, actually. And, you know, some people might have a view that some of the buildings further up are monstrosities, but oddly enough, when you mix them all together and you get such a paradoxical mix, that it does seem to work. So having that style of building, I don't think harms the nature of the view along the coast. In terms of 3 properties, I think the way it's designed by the architect is quite clever. It's up to buyers whether they like the fact that the middle one you're channeled in through the back through a narrower element that then opens up at the front. But it's a clever wedge shape to accommodate 3 buildings, and I don't see any harm in that. It's up to the individual whether they like it at the time of purchase. So yeah, I can't see any objection to it. The only point I would make just to the officers is because of the extensive nature of the building, I know there's a protection order on the trees, I suspect, but just to make sure that there's no mission creep and that's enforced, because with those lovely balconies and glass facades, I'd imagine that you might get some people going in there that would love to clear the trees, but we must make sure that doesn't happen. But I don't see any objection. Thank you.
Do we have any more speakers? Oh, Councillor Gardner.
Okay. Obviously,
Joe, do you want to put your microphone on?
taking it back off. Obviously, I mean, I live in an area where there's a lot of TPOs on my site, and it's really important that residents go on to respect these TPOs. My observation from that is there are very few trees obstructing the view, and I think that will be a key point for potential buyers, that they get a view of the wonderful estuary. But I do think it's really crucial that we have effective TPOs set on this site before it is built. And it's quite important to me that would happen.
And I think you make a good point there. That's something that needs to be in the conditions, etc., that protect those trees.
Do you want me to come on?
Yeah.
Yeah, the protection and impact of the development on the trees is something that we've been looking at as is one of the factors, obviously, with any application where there are trees on the site. The plan on the screen here shows that there is actually one that's of a poor quality tree that comes out, which is this one here. But then there is 3 trees planted to effectively fill this gap that you can see from the aerial image there. With the development site including that area, that gives an opportunity for planning conditions to be drafted to ensure that there is not just protection during construction, but there is ongoing management of those trees, which is there to help with the setting of the conservation area and the setting of the properties. So it would be specifically designed to cover off the possibility that that Councillor Farrington alluded to of future works in there.
Are there any other comments or questions or points that members want to make? Or I'm happy to propose this if I can get a seconder. Okay, Councillor Evans, thank you. Put your hand up. So I'm proposing. Councillor Evans is seconding.
Just for clarity, Chairman, the proposal is to delegate authority to the head of planning with the conditions, and I'm sure the points being discussed will be included in those conditions.
And I think, to be fair, you know, to reflect some of the comments that have been made by the committee, we want to place great emphasis on the need for strict conditions that protect this site as far as possible. All those in favour, please indicate. All those against? 2. And any abstentions? Right. Thank you. We go to item 3, which is on page 45.
Okay, we're in Singleton again. Indeed. We're not actually in Singleton Village, we're up on Mains Lane though. So we're on, the application site is generally, the best place of describing it is close to the Shard Bridge turn-off, up to Hambleton and the likes up there. It's in the countryside, in that location. The application in front of us is an outline application, so it's proposing the erection of a single dwelling on a site and relates to all matters being reserved. So effectively it's the position that came before the one that we dealt with first this afternoon. Freudian slip. The Parish Council have raised objections to this. Their concerns relate primarily to the principle of housing development and the amount of housing development that they see in Singleton without any support in services being enhanced. And the officer's recommendation is for approval. So the site is part of the garden to a dwelling. So it currently contains its garage. So if you look at the image on your left of the screen, that's the Shard Road junction. You've then got a field, and then we've got a run of 7 dwellings before with another break, and then that pattern continues as you go up towards the Singleton service station. Obviously, residential properties opposite. This is the property itself, or this is the access to the property. So the main part of the property is behind this this hedge wall, railings, trees combination boundary that you've got on the front, which is not dissimilar to many of the other boundaries in that part of Mains Lane. Mains Lane is currently a trunk road, but is being detrunked and will be passed to Lancashire County Council in due course following the completion of the bypass section. So, slightly closer image. So this is roughly where the site is. The question that we're looking at, because it's in the countryside, that is protective of new development, but does allow for minor infill development. So that's the test that we're looking at, is whether this scheme is minor infill. So this is a site plan that we've had. So this is the existing house, its garage, access point that you can see. That's the application site. Sorry, that's the application property. So the application site is effectively that sliver, or not sliver, but that element of it. This is an illustrative plan of how a dwelling could be positioned on that site, but that's not for consideration here. That will be a future matter for dealing with the reserve matters. We've also got an indication of how the access could work. Although with this being a classified road, they would need a separate planning permission for that access if they were to separate the two. But again, that's a matter for further down the line, should this outline planning permission be granted. So what we're looking at is effectively the principle of putting a dwelling on that site. It's in the countryside, restrictive. Is it minor infill? Well, it's minor because it's one, and there is existing dwellings around there. So is it infill? Well, we've consistently interpreted that as the filling of a limited gap in an otherwise continuously built up frontage. So what we've got here is a row of 7 properties, all of which have a relatively consistent width. They all have a relatively consistent building line, albeit they follow the bend of the road, and that gives us a built-up frontage. Whilst this site contains a garage, that's single storey, it's a much smaller building than the other properties, so there is effectively a gap between the dwelling and the neighbouring dwelling that is comparable to the size of the other dwellings, oops, gone the wrong way, to the size of the other plots. So that plot, for example, that plot is very similar to this plot, is effectively double the width of the majority of its neighbours on both sides of the road. So taking that example forward, you've got a break here, you've got a break here, but you've got a built-up frontage here that's continuous. You've got a gap in it. Therefore, the principle of developing a dwelling on that site constitutes the minor infill development that policy GD4 is permissible of. So that leads us to the point that this satisfies the development plan policy. It's a windfall scheme that comes forward and is supported by the development strategy, and that offsets the concerns of the parish council, because the development strategy is intended to deliver development across the borough, and that's this is meeting that strategy. Just some of the other details, obviously it's in outline, as I've said, so all that would need to be dealt with by a further application. That would include the access, but there isn't really any argument that it's not going to be feasible to provide an access to that road, or for 2 dwellings to use the existing access. The separation to neighbours, including the application property, is something realistically for reserve matters, but it's viable because it's not squeezed in, so it's going to be right up against the neighbouring property. There are no ecology issues from the survey that was provided. This scheme may well need to provide biodiversity net gain, but at the moment it's we can't be sure of that because we don't know where the property would sit on the site, but that's a matter that we would deal with at reserve matters as necessary. Just touching on this, it is relatively accessible to the services, whilst there's none that near. You've got Poulton, which is a relatively comfortable cycle distance. You've got the petrol filling station up the road, so it's not an accessible location. So the officer recommendation is to grant permission as the agenda.
Thank you. Any questions or comments? Yes, Councillor Farrington.
To me, it didn't seem that contentious until you put the graphic up that showed an example of potential future property. So I just wondered, in reality, if you could give us your opinion as to whether that's perhaps a red herring. Would a real application put forward sit further back, or am I just asking something so hypothetical it's impossible to answer? But because that in itself, to me, if it was presented as a package and that was part of it, I would be unhappy with it. But we're not talking about that today. We're talking about the concept of overall permission, you know, for the land itself.
Yeah, I think you probably you are right in terms of the scheme here isn't looking at that. They could have provided just a red line plan without any indication of how it could sit inside, and that would be what we've considered. What they've done, they've gone beyond that and provided this illustrative plan, which clearly shows a dwelling that occupies the whole width of the site. That doesn't seem to me to be necessarily the development pattern in that area. So when we get to considerations of layout and scale at reserve matters stage, that will be a point that we're looking at with them about whether that development is too big in that form for that site. It does, whilst it sits forward of the neighbouring property to the left and sits behind that to the right, that is perhaps more of a consequence of it being on that bend on the road. So it may be that plan, because it's tightly focused on the properties just either side, it gives perhaps a slightly misleading impression of that. But those are things that we will be dealing with them about at reserve matters stage should the scheme come forward on that basis.
Yeah, so we're effectively dealing with the principle of development here, and if you accept the minor infill argument in terms of GD4, that's the central point. So, have we got anybody that would like to move approval? Thank you, Councillor Pittman. Anybody? Councillor Wilder?
Councillor Wilder to second.
Second. All those in favour, please indicate. All those against? One. Thank you. Any abstentions? Just one abstention, is it, rather than against? Just one abstention, yes. Thank you. We move on to the last item, which, yeah, we're getting used to your voice now, Andrew. Item 4, which is on page 60, which, refreshingly in a way, doesn't take us back to Singleton. It takes us somewhere else in the wonderful file, and that's Ray Green.
Yeah, this is an application. Thank you, Chairman. This is an application in Ray Green, also in the conservation area. This relates to extensions to an existing dwelling, which perhaps looks a lot like an infill dwelling at some point. So the proposal is, it's in the settlement, obviously it fronts onto the green you saw from that image. The proposal is to raise the roof of the property by 500 mil to provide the opportunity for some accommodation in the roof slope, in the roof space. There's also a very short front extension, and there's a dormer to one side which is to facilitate the stairs up to the first floor. The Parish Council have objected to the scheme. The design was revised, the scale of the extension was reduced, and some elements were remitted, but the Parish Council have restated their objection, so that's obviously their prerogative, and that's why we're here. So this is the property, single storey, true bungalow, sits alongside, this is a true bungalow as well. This is a thatched roof cottage type property. And it's just on the, as you see, just on the corner of the green, most likely an infill at some stage. Looks like that. So the big yellow arrow points you to where the dwelling is. So you can see you've got this larger true bungalow to the right hand side, and then these thatched roof cottages to the left. This is the application scheme. So you may be able to see that there's a raising of the ridge and a raising of the eaves. What you can see is the front elevation changes. So effectively they're bringing a forward projecting to add a modernisation of the property. So it's gone from that sort of relatively bland, drab appearance. No, I never touched it. Obviously that's not true. Perhaps I'll turn that down from 100. In fact, turn it off. Okay. Right, where was I? So we go from that design to include some timber panelling, sort of a frame around the building, and larger elements of glazing, taking advantage of the views over the green and that the modern outlook that brings. In terms of the plan view, so at the moment all the accommodation is single storey ground floor. So we've got this forward projection, which is 800mm. Here we have a dormer to the side, which provides a return for the stairs, and then we're now moving the lounge up to the first floor to take advantage of the position. An earlier scheme had a balcony at the rear, but that would have overlooked a neighbouring garden, so that's been omitted, and that room now just benefits from roof lights to provide its light and outlook to it. So that's the property again in some closer views. These are some aerial images to show. What I wanted to show here is that whilst it's in the conservation area features quite a range of properties. You haven't got a consistent building line, you haven't got a consistent scale of properties, you haven't got a consistent design to them, you haven't got consistent, everything is different. Looking around the corner, you've got perhaps more examples here. That's a relatively modern property. This has been extended in a modern way recently. Then you've got some quite old farmers' cottages style properties here. Timber panelling here. You do have a real range. So I think in terms of bringing in the design features that you see with this element here, and the relatively modest changes that you've got in terms of the appearance of the property and its scale, it's not adding any harm to the conservation area. One of the things that you are doing, or the scheme is doing, is it's rendering the properties, but that's one of the reasons I put this slide on, is that you've got rendered properties either side, unlike some of the brick properties which are St Anne's style brick. This property has a more modern appearance with a less remarkable brick. And all in all, feel that the principle of extending properties in settlement is fine. Feel that there's no harm to the conservation area, so we don't need to look at the public benefits. The street scene is very varied. There have been changes to the scheme to address some overlooking and privacy concerns. We now feel that the scheme's been dropped in height, so we feel that the massing arrangements to the neighbouring properties, particularly the bungalow, which has side-facing windows, are now acceptable. The scheme provides parking on the front, and that was one of the areas that the parish council were concerned about, in that it lost some, but not all, of the front garden, and they felt that wasn't necessary. But you'll see that there is a condition about providing a hedge and maintaining the landscaping on the frontage, which was designed as a reflection of the conservation area character, where you do have rural style boundary treatments around the green, which is the same here. So the idea would be that perhaps 2/3 of that garden area is provided for parking, and the front third is retained as landscaping and hedging. So on that basis, the officer recommendation is for approval.
Yeah, thank you. Members, any questions or comments? I mean, personally, but my view on this particular application is that it's probably enhanced the street scene. It was a fairly mundane building that was there before the present bungalow, and what they've done is probably created a more interesting building. And the other thing about Ray Green, which has already been picked up by Andrew in the report, is that if you know Ray Green, there isn't an example of a typical Ray Green building. That's, in a way, that's what some people like about it, and what others don't like about it is that, you know, you go to some village greens and you get sort of stereotypical, don't you, cottages, etc., all the way around, and they're all very similar. Whereas here you've got what I would call a fairly eclectic mix of property, which also gives it a certain appeal. Is anybody willing to propose, please? Councillor Griffiths.
And Councillor Evans wished to come in, I think.
Oh, Councillor Evans wanted to come in. Oh, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. So you would say it was in a assorted chocolate box rather than just a chocolate box, maybe.
Your words, not mine.
Thank you. I would just take on board Andrew's point there, and I don't know if there's any way that we can actually insist on a certain amount of divide between garden and forecourt in terms of that property, but I would say, in keeping with, we don't want it just to be a little token strip at the front of the garden. It needs to be in keeping with the gardens around it, I would say. So that would be my only proviso, but I'm happy to support this application.
Yeah, can I just confirm it was Councillor Griffiths that proposed it and Councillor Evans seconding it? Thank you. Well, do you want to come in before we have the vote?
Yes, please, just to pick up on Councillor Owens' point, I fully agree. Condition 5 on page 72 specifically says that there is a need to submit a soft landscaping scheme which relates to the approved plan, and the approved plan would be, subject to the vote that's about to happen, would be this plan on the right hand side here. So that's where we get to the area of green on the front. So you provide 3 feasible parking spaces across the front of the property, given that it's a 3-bedroom property, but then retain an area at the front for landscaping. That landscaping could include a hedge, which would be preferable to the concrete block wall that's there at the moment. So that's kind of the direction I'm seeing it going in terms of what we expect to come from the scheme that's submitted under condition 5.
Thank you, Andrew. Can we move to the vote? All those in favour, please indicate. I think that's unanimous. So thank you, members, for your patience and diligence this morning. It's been quite a long session.
Very briefly.
And Andrew, yes, come on, please.
Sorry, just one last thing. There's no appeals to report this time, but committee will recall refusing an application at 189 St Andrews Road South for a care home, going back a couple of meetings. That decision is subject to an appeal, and we've received a start date letter for that yesterday. So tomorrow, once I finish committee and something this afternoon, I will be writing to the residents to notify them of that. Ian Curtis is masterminding the council's case, given that as officers we recommended it for approval, which is in accordance with the committee protocol for such things. But you will recall there was some quite keen resident interest in it. So I think those residents will be made aware today that the appeals start date's here, so they may well contact you about it as well. We will be passing all comments made to the Planning Inspectorate, and Ian Curtis will be putting a case together to argue why the committee's decision was justified in the circumstances.
That's the one with the railway line at the back of it, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
I think, to be fair, I think everybody involved in that was cognizant of the fact that this might happen. So I think we're all sort of, yeah, well,
Yeah, just give you a heads up in
halfway.
case
But thank you.
You get resident contact.
Okay, right, thank you. Thank you to officers as well for their work this morning. Thank you.